All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to the Indiana Farmers Market Community of Practice November webinar, Proposal Writing. I am Christina Ferroli, the Grants Program Coordinator for the Indiana Cooperative Development Center. With us today, we have Cathy Brown. Cathy designs and teaches courses for the Fundraising School, an institute of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IUPUI. She has 20 plus years experience in nonprofit management and fundraising, including proposal development and grant management, in addition to expertise in curriculum design and instruction. Cathy received a Bachelor of Arts from Hanover College, Master of Science in Education from Indiana University, and Graduate Certificate in Philanthropic Studies from Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IUPUI. She is a nationally certified associate professional in talent development. I want to remind everyone to please remain muted during the presentation. And if you have questions, drop them into the chat and we will have time at the end for a Q&A. Thank you and welcome, Cathy.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with all of you on what's I know a very busy time of year for all of us. Shout out to all of our Purdue Extension friends. Christine and I remembered just before this all started that we probably connected back in our extension days as well. But glad to have all of you with us. And again, thanks for being here. We're going to take some time and just think about this whole idea of writing grant proposals. And we'll start out, as I said, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you've got questions, as Christina mentioned, don't hesitate to pop them in there. We'll monitor those as we go and have plenty of time at the end. But let's just get started with a quick overview of foundations in the US. And what we happen to know is it is the fastest growing market of all funding markets, certainly in 2020, and on track similarly this year. There are over 119,000 foundations registered in the US with trillion with a T in assets. And last year, 88 billion in giving throughout the nonprofit sector. So that just gives you a big, broad look at the foundation market in particular, which we'll spend a little bit of our time today talking about. But our overall objective, as you saw, as you registered for the program, is to work through sort of the three key areas of proposal development as the process of creating and writing proposals. And we're condensing what we teach in a 16-hour class into about 45 minutes. So we'll go over some of the key areas. And then you will have access to both the presentation and a resource sheet that'll be shared with you afterwards. So don't worry about being frantic about taking notes, that you'll get that information as well. So today what we're going to do is we're initially going to talk about how we prepare for a successful project development. Then we'll get into how we match funders with our project or proposal. And then we'll finish with how we create those successful projects or proposals. So that is the plan for the day. And with that, we'll start out with, again, just a little bit of highlighting of foundations or funders in general. We'll spend most of our times together today talking about private foundations, which are also sometimes called independent foundations. And it's the largest portion of foundations in the US today. They generally are established by individuals or families, but then move forward into operating independently outside of just a family influence. Now, family foundations are sort of a little subsector under these private or independent foundations. And that is a really quickly growing segment in the foundation market, and could be formalized very similar to what a private foundation looks like, or could be much less formal. I have a friend whose family has their own family foundation. Their giving decisions are made around their Thanksgiving dinner table. So it's a pretty wide range of how those particular types of foundations operate. We'll dive into that a little bit further. We also have operating foundations. We'll spend a little less time on that today, simply because operating foundations are set up to raise funds for a particular entity. The Indiana University Foundation raises money for Indiana University. So while entities within the university can get funding from that foundation, entities outside that university don't typically. Your local school education foundation would be similarly set up in that way. So we don't spend as much time working with operating foundations unless you happen to have or be part of an operating foundation within your own entity. We also may be working with corporate foundations. These are typically, just as they sound, set up within or inside of companies. Large or small businesses doesn't necessarily mean it's not always a large company that sets it up, but that's another source of funding. And then you may be familiar with community foundations. Certainly the Central Indiana Community Foundation is one that is well known to a number of those of us in and from Indiana. And these are entities that raise funds from the public and then engage in grant making primarily within a specific geographic region. Central Indiana Community Foundation funds things in Central Indiana. Interestingly, there's kind of a wide range of how the community foundations define their geographic region. And for example, Silicon Valley Community Foundation out in California says that their geography is the globe. So really anyone could apply for funding through the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, where in the CICF, you want to be somewhere in the region that they serve. So it's just some ways to kind of think about the types of funders we might be working with. You might also work with government funding. You might work with other types of funders, fraternal organizations, churches, and so on. But the process of applying for funding is very similar throughout these entities. There might be some small nuances that differentiate, but what we'll talk about today are the core strategies that apply across the board through all of these types of funders. The other things that, just as we're kind of opening up to talk a little bit about just the types of funding we might be applying for, there's what we might call a traditional grant. That's what you think of when you hear somebody talk about grant writing or proposal writing. It's where there is a funder who has put out an opportunity for funds to be earned or applied for, and then you fill out their application, do the things that they ask you to do, and then they choose to fund some of those applicants. So that's more of a traditional format. Newer grants that we're seeing are coming from donor advised funds, which there's lots of information out. The quick, very simplistic definition is that donors are giving funding, a chunk of funding to a fund holder, which is generally either a community foundation or a private entity, Schwab, Fidelity, there's some different ones. And donors do that to get the full tax break right then, but then can determine with that fund holder where those funds go. And we've seen a big increase in that over the last few years, though it's been a resource available to donors for many years, since the 30s, I believe. But it's certainly gained interest and strength over the last last few years in any case. You might get endowment funding. That's where a fund has been set up with an entity that the principal is basically not touched, but the interest that's earned is paid out in various formats. There again, we might get government funding, we might get corporate funding through their corporate foundation or through other types of corporate funding, which we'll talk about in a moment here. And then there are other mechanisms as well that bring in funding for our entities to do their work, as you see. So the key there is just to kind of think about who we're applying to and how we're reaching out, and the type of funding that we're seeking, sort of the source that we're looking to for these funds. Now, Another quick point just to highlight as we start thinking about these working with and applying for grants is to determine, are we looking for a grant or are we looking for a sponsorship? Because there are some differentiations and those influence or affect how we apply. So as you can see here, partnerships are, or grants are more partnerships. You are working with a funder together to make something happen. Where in a sponsorship, it's more an idea of providing the visibility for the person or the entity that you're working with. Grants are operative in that you're working again with a funder to make something happen. Sponsorships are a little more transactional. They're providing funds for this visibility, this appearance at your event, or this signage at your market, or whatever it may be. You'll see some of the other key differences. The time frame is one that's a big indicator. Grants tend to run 1 to 3 years. I don't know of too many that are longer than that. Or too many that are shorter than a year, but there's a longer time frame, whereas a sponsorship is typically a day of or an event specific time frame. So again, the time frame's different, and understanding some of these key differences helps you realize what it is that you seek and what it is that the funder provides, so that you can create the application appropriately to get what's necessary. In some cases where we apply for a grant and then we really are just looking for sponsorships. We're looking for someone to, be the key sponsor at a dinner, or have the key signage at an event. But if we're applying for a full grant, there's going to be a lot more to it that's required that we may not need to do in order to meet our goals. So it's important to think through which you are looking for to know how to best match up your project and the funder. And the last thing we'll do quickly here is just take an overall look at foundation landscape. I gave you a couple of numbers right as we kicked off, but as I mentioned at that point, private or independent foundations are the largest portion of foundations in our funding cycle in the foundation market. In the last year, they contributed $37.1 billion toward all of the foundation giving that happened in the last year. This has been a substantially growing market. Certainly over the last 40 years, but even from 2019 to 2020, we saw a 19% growth in the foundation market as far as providing funding to entities and organizations. And what you've got here on this slide is simply giving you some feeling for the types of areas that foundations support, the top 5 populations that they serve, and sort of the top 5 strategies or funding goals that they will support. And these are helpful to know just so that you can start to shape your projects to help them see that you do serve economically disadvantaged people, for example, and that you are providing education as well as health programming. Knowing sort of what those key points are helps you build your story to make that connection to the funder. But before we get to finding those funders, we want to start with the first part of the process, which is identifying and developing your project or program. Now, that may sound surprising for those of you that haven't done work in this area, that we don't first seek out the funder, but that's actually a pretty common mistake. You hear that a funder or foundation has a call for proposals and they've got a certain amount of money that they're going to share out. And so the organization says, oh, let's get that money. Let's come up with a program to fit that, or let's try to wiggle one of our programs into that. It's not an efficient use of your time. And very often it's clear to the funder that's what's happened. So we really want to think about what you need and then work toward connecting the funder. And you won't know which funders are right until you have that project at least outlined or thought through. Otherwise, we just call that chasing the money. which is exhausting for one. And if you've been in entities or organizations where that's been a mindset, you know that that's a really tiresome action. And it's really not very effective. So we want to begin with the idea of building the need. Right? We call the need, the reason that we need funds. In fundraising, we call that building the case for support. Though it does include more than just identifying the problem. But here's a hint as you start thinking about the problem that you want to address as an entity. You want to start with, oftentimes we'll start with, we need, right? We need this. We need money too. And the problem as we're building the case for support should not be that we need money, right? That's a process. From the funder's viewpoint, we are the conduit to the path to the results that they want to achieve. So your need is more the community issue or the problem that you're going to work to solve. So it shifts the focus and shows that you've done your due diligence. You've looked out at the sector. You've understood a little bit more about food safety and security, food insecurities in your community, and you've identified a gap that needs to be filled, right? And so we start with this development of this need or creation or understanding of the problem. Who's being affected? How are they being effective? Why are they being effective? And where does that fit? And how do we know this? What proof or data do we have that supports this problem, right? So we're looking at an urgent need, and that we're the ones as a farmer's market, for example, we're the ones who are the right ones to solve this problem or address this issue. We want to focus on what the cause is of the problem or who the participants or beneficiaries are, not just on what we need to do. And that's part of building an effective needs statement or really identifying that problem that you're setting out to solve. And it's also a good opportunity to provide the support for, we have the staff to do this, or we have the technology, or we have the equipment and the space and so on. It's okay at that point to share what we have, but it's toward meeting this external or community-based need. We then move into showing the solution. What are we going to do about it? What are the end goals and objectives, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. What's our timeline for accomplishing this? What activities are going to be handled? How are we going to spend this money that we're, inviting this funder to provide? And we want to be realistic about the solutions. We want to be careful. There's always a fine line between building a vision of success and over-promising. If you're applying for a $500 grant, you don't want to promise you're going to end hunger in your community. That's a little overzealous. It might take a little more than that, and it might take more than a year. So we want to be realistic, but we want to maybe work toward that goal over time and then piece out exactly what this particular project will do toward that bigger vision. Then we want to share the results. What do we anticipate the results will be? Again, we want to be realistic, but it's okay to be optimistic. The funders understand that we are not, future seekers. We cannot predict the future, but we can anticipate that with, everything lining up the way that it's supposed to, these are the results we can expect. And then you also want to share how you'll know that that's true. So we anticipate, having this many more people at our markets and, these many more people buying healthy food choices or making healthy food choices, but how will you know that? Because our funders want to understand not only that this will change, but how you're going to determine that. And then finally, they want to know the impact. What difference will this funding make? And so let's look at that just for a moment, because this is an area that is often sort of undersold in grant applications. And I've seen that certainly in my own application work. And more recently, I've served on a lot of funding sides, reviewing applications and proposals. And we see this often, that the impact isn't well highlighted. And I'll use a simple example first outside of your sector. When we hear about and we talk about, just to kind of give you the idea of scholarships for education programs, both higher ed and even in some K-12 examples, there are needs for scholarships. So many times an educational entity will say, we need scholarships. That's the need. We've defined the need. The argument there is that the scholarship isn't the need. The scholarship is the solution. That's what the organization can provide through the funding. But we have to back up from that solution to say, what is the need? Why are scholarships necessary? Well, if you've looked at college tuition lately, you know the answer to that. It's expensive, right? And if we want equal access for anyone who's qualified and interested to be able to attend in an educational institution, we've got to figure out ways to move those financial barriers. That's the need, that there are financial barriers in many cases that prevent or impede someone from accessing, a higher education institution, for example. The action we need to take, as you can see here, then, is to reduce those barriers. And the solution is through scholarships. Oftentimes, though, that's where the story ends, but that's not the impact. Right? The impact is more students get scholarships, but the result of that is that we have more graduates with less debt. So that's how you want to sort of build your need, action, solution, and impact. And if you walk away from here with nothing else, hang on to this slide, because this really explains and helps you work through the exact steps of a grant proposal. What's the need? What are you going to do about it? What's the solution? And what will change? Those are the four sort of key areas that nearly every funder is looking for. Right now, we often build this out in a longer format. And for those of you in the Purdue Extension system, you'll be already familiar with the logic model. But this is a process we're not going to get into the details of here, but that's what we build most effective grant proposals on, is that idea of working through the different steps. Once you've created the need, you've defined what that community need is, and you know what the impact or change is that you want at the end. So you've got your need here. And you've got your impact here. We've got to show the funder how we're going to get from A to B, right? So we start with goals and objectives. What are you going to do and how are you going to do it? Maybe the goal is to increase the number of people who have access to healthy choices through education, experiences, and access, okay? Then we move to the activities. How are we going to do that? What actions are going to happen? Right? Maybe we're going to have workshops and specific vegetable tastings. And maybe we're going to consider some transportation options as part of the project. So then next we move to the outputs. How will we initially know that something is different, right? These are the immediate results. How many people attend the workshop? How many fill out a survey response and tell us that they've tried a new vegetable and liked it? Or whatever that may be, but it's those initial numbers, right? So you want to think through what are we going to do? What activities are going to happen? What are the initial results of those activities? And then we get into the outcomes and impact. These are those longer term results and change. Okay, how many more people are returning to the market on a regular basis? How many more transportation access opportunities are there now than there were 3 years ago? Was a new bus line run? Did another entity purchase a van to bring their residents to the market once a month, or whatever those longer term impacts and changes would be? Now, once you've kind of worked through the project, we still haven't looked at who the funders are yet, because you've got to know a lot of this ahead of time to be able to match up to a strong funder. But we've also got to tell them how we're going to do this financially, which is a budget and a budget narrative. So we've got to have both pieces of that. How are we going to spend it? And the explanation of what each of those line items might mean for your budgeting process. Then we want to build a timeline so that they understand within the terms of the grant period what's going to happen and when. This is really helpful when you're doing lots of different things within the organization to have this timeline so that you don't end up scheduling the big report at the same time as the last market of the year, or some other big event or activity that is going to really max your time. So you build out a timeline, and then you build out your evaluation plans. This is how you're going to know it worked. And this is how you're going to keep it going after the funding ends, right? So that sustainability portion. And here's a little hint, as I have reviewed applications over the years, I have found that a lot of times that evaluation and sustainability piece is simply a statement like, we will seek additional grant funding. Okay, well, that may be the plan, but that doesn't build a lot of confidence with the funder. So get more specific about that. We plan to develop and strengthen relationships with 4 additional potential grant funders to continue this project outside the funding cycle, or something like that, that's specific so that you and your funder will know that you will be successful in completing and continuing the project, if it's a project that continues. So once you've built this project all together, then it'll be time to start looking for funders. But in order to do that, you've got to kind of summarize and build your story. So, and this is just sort of a quick way to look at that. You want to start with this big idea, this big problem, or this situation that you hope to address. You've got this idea, you're gonna work through the problem. You've got a solution in mind, or a set of solutions that are going to help. You've got some results that you're hoping to accomplish, and that leads the funder to an understanding of how that project's going to make a difference. And all of this needs to be developed before you go and seek that funder. Pardon me one. All right, so let's look at how we match funders. Once you've done this outline, that's the time to go out and seek who's the best match for your funding goals. To do that, you were looking for a key series of bits of information that you can summarize with an understanding, first of all, of who have they funded? Who else has been part of their funding cycle? Maybe your organization has been funded in the past. That's helpful to know if you weren't part of that process. They have funded other organizations like yours, or maybe they haven't, but you think there's a good match. That's helpful to know ahead of time so that you can address that as part of your story. What kinds of things do they fund? Do they fund equipment? Do they fund salaries? These are the key things to understand so that you find the right match. If you're looking for specific pieces of equipment and you find a funder that doesn't do that, it's going to be a waste of everyone's time for you to work on that application. Where do they fund? Are there geographic challenges, limits, restrictions? How much do they give? You certainly don't want to waste time on an application when you're seeking $5,000 and they typically fund $500 gifts. Or going the other way, it's not worth applying for $5,000 to a funder who typically funds $50,000, because they're not going to see your project as large enough in scope to meet their goals. So that's why it's so important to know ahead of time what your funding looks like, what your project looks like, and what you need so that you can better match your funder. You also want to look at what other groups or special populations do they serve. Certainly that's been, it's not really a change, but it's a shift forward in priority for many foundations now, as there's been a growth in the diversity, equity, inclusion movement or audiences. There are a lot more foundations focusing in on those as special populations they want to serve. And then the final piece is to be sure that you understand the rules. What are the restrictions? Is it only funded during a certain time? Are there steps that you have to accomplish before you get your funding? Are there matching requirements? There's nothing more frustrating than getting a grant and just learning after you've been approved that you have to raise the first $10,000 before you get the grant funding. That should be in the application process, and you should know that ahead of time. What kind of reporting do they ask for? Again, this can be really powerful if they're asking for monthly reports, and that's beyond the capacity of your organization with everything else going on. So you want to be realistic about what kind of reporting schedule do they need, and can you meet that? And then of course you want to take a look at the deadlines. While, you know, we're all human, we all make mistakes, you want to be sure that you are really tuned into their deadlines and working to meet those if at all possible. And if not, then you want to be sure that you've let them know ahead of time that you're going to be a little bit delayed and why. And they'll let you know if that's something that's acceptable. Finding our funders starts by just a quick look at the 990. And you can find this, you can do a Google search. What we're focused on most often as we're starting to look at funders are things like contact information, because it may or may not be accurate on their website, who their partners and other funding partners may be, who's on their board. A lot of this information can be really helpful in making those connections to find out who the right funders are going to be. And what you'll spend most of your time on are the 990 and the 990 PF. The 990 form itself is where you'll find information about community foundations, for example, and how they give, what their assets are, their total donations, the total grants that they've received, and if they make grants out into the community. Sometimes they will list out who those grantors are. The private foundation form, the 990 PF, those foundations are required to list the grants that they award for a specific fiscal year. So you'll be able to see easily everyone who's been funded and how much their grants are, and even the types of projects in some cases that were funded. So that's a great starting place to do just a 990 search. You can use Candid, which is one listed here at the bottom of the slide as one resource. To do that search, you can use your favorite search engine, but there are lots of ways to get to that information. That's a great starting point. Certainly, there are other resources as well. Again, digitally online, Candid has a number of resources that you can see here. And again, you're getting a copy of this presentation PDF, so you'll have these resources. There are other digital resources as well. If you're looking at government funding, grants.gov has everything you need to know. Just set aside some time so that you can work through their processes. Lots of other online digital resources. Don't forget to also ask around. Ask your other nonprofit friends, ask your other colleagues where they're gaining funding. There are local and regional publications in Indianapolis. I know the IBJ lists funders, lists different grants that have been received, highlights nonprofits. So those are good. Those types of resources can be very helpful in getting a sense of who's funding what and who might be interested in your project or program. You know, and then again, don't forget about groups like banks. Chamber of Commerce may be helpful in something like that. They know what their businesses are looking for and may help you find good partners. Nonprofit networks and lots of other resources to help you kind of think about and find these funders. So let's move to our final little step here, which is how we sort of put this all together. Once you've built your project outline, you've done a little bit of research, you've found some funders who may be helpful for you, you've reviewed their proposal requirements, and you figured out that you want to pursue a proposal with one of these applicants or one of these funders. Generally, funders will, or at least often, I shouldn't say it's not all the time, but often they will use this initial screening process called an LOI, which could be a letter of interest, a letter of intent, a letter of inquiry. I've even heard a letter of introduction. Technically, they're not exactly the same things, but for our purposes here today, the idea is that we send out a short letter or a short summary of what we're proposing so that we can get some interest. We can find out if the organization is interested, if the funder is interested before we spend all our time on their application. We might request some certain materials, or they might request some specific materials. It gives us a chance to outline the project. And then if that LOI is approved, you are generally then invited to apply for a full proposal or to send in a full proposal. Not every funder uses this, but it's becoming more and more common as a way, again, to do some initial screening, but also to learn a little bit more about potential projects and things that they may be interested in. These are typically short. You'll see here one recommendation, a pretty general one, is not more than 3 pages. I have seen in some cases, if there's a request for an LOI, they'll ask you to do it in 1. So that's, again, why it's so important to have that project spelled out so that you can pick the pieces that are going to be most important for them to know and to want to learn more. So building that, again, the funder will have some specifics either on their website or through the research that you've done to learn about how they request funding that will be helpful for you to figure out whether you need to do this, and if so, what those regulations or requirements would be. If you've been invited to submit a proposal, or maybe you're working with a funder who doesn't require a letter of interest or letter of intent, you want to then build your story out again before you start filling out the application. For one thing, online applications have character limits. So every word that you include needs to serve a strong purpose. I have seen in fact, I've even had some experience in my own proposal development where if you don't have a good sense of how long that application, how long that particular box is for you to fill out the answer to the question, that you get about halfway through and you run out of characters. And then it's really challenging to try to do that editing in the system. So we really strongly encourage you to do that in some word or word processing software first, so that you can transfer over the information, cut and paste as needed. You also want to know your audience. And that seems a little odd. If you've identified the funder, you've picked out who you want the funding to come from, but you want to think about who's reading the proposal. You can do a little research. Who's on the board? Chances are pretty good it's going to be some of the board members that are involved in this. And you can do a little bit of research. You can look them up on LinkedIn. You can look them up on Facebook and find out a little bit more about them. That will help as you are building your application to see who you're writing to. For example, I serve on a community giving group here. I live in Pensacola, Florida, and our group is all women. So that could be powerful to know and understand as you're building the application to get funding from that particular group. They skew in a certain age range. So that, again, could just start to give you some ideas. It just helps you visualize who you're writing to, that can then help you create the story that you want them to know and understand. Excuse me. We also want to understand, and again, you can get into a lot more detail here, but how you build the story. It's not just facts and figures. You do want to create a story as best you can by starting with grabbing the interest. What's going to grab someone's interest? Here's a hint. It's not going to be, we first started our program in 1974, right? That's not an interest grabber. An interest grabber might be, you introduce them to a participant, someone who is wandering through the market, looking for or wishing they could, try some of these new things. You want to give something that catches the attention and helps to identify the problem in a story format that you can sort of carry through the application. Because at the end of the day, these are people reading these applications, and we want to be able to get their interest, to gather their desire to help make this solution happen that you're proposing. So it is okay to include emotions, right? It's a nice place to balance between emotion and the data, facts, and figures. Once you get to this point, you want to review the guidelines and the processes. Again, online applications may have character limits. They may have time limits. There's nothing worse than getting timed out of the application and having to start over. I can tell you that from personal experience. And they may have other specific requirements. So you want to be sure you read through all of the necessary information to help understand how to work through the process. But as you're building ahead of time, before you start filling it out, as you're building your information, this is a basic format. Most funders will have an outline of exactly what they want you to submit, but this is a pretty good list of what would be included. You'd have a summary. This is your executive summary. This is the sort of the short version of what you're asking for. And the hint there is to write that last. Develop the project and program first and then summarize it. That way you can introduce them to something that they're going to learn more about. Again, your statement of need, that's your problem, how you're going to do your program, that's your activities, how you're going to evaluate, how you're going to plan the budget, how you're going to sustain the programs, and so on. If you can get through if you build this list prior to creating the application, you'll be able to then just pull in the information as needed. A couple of things here as we kind of come to the close. Some tips from a couple of my colleagues. The first is Michael Stachowiak, who is the grant development and in charge of grant development administration for Cranbrook in Michigan. But he's been doing this work for over 20 years, has a very long list of successful grants in his portfolio. And he has sort of these 3 key tips. First of all, it's got to be readable. This is not a dissertation. Save the fluffy language and the jargon. You want to make these concise, short paragraphs highlighting the key information. You want to link people and ideas and budgets together so that it all makes sense. And again, footnotes and other complicated processes may or may not be allowed in the online formats. You may be able to use that a little bit if you're still working with an entity that prefers a written document. There are still out there, but many more of these have moved online. He also says it should be informative. You want to be able to pick up on the gist of the proposal in any of the different sections, in particular because not all of the sections of the grant will be read in order by the review committee, and in some cases, they may not be read at all. I've served on committees where I was only in charge of reading the executive summary. I didn't ever see the budget. Somebody else read that and reviewed that. You know, I've been in other applications where you read through the whole thing and then split up, you know, the sections that you're going to be more responsible for reviewing. Different funders do it different ways. And so you want to be prepared and make sure that if they're just reading the budget and the budget narrative, they can still understand what the point of the project is. And then finally, he says it should be personal. You want to include facts and stories. You want to help them understand and feel the problem and the solution. Again, not just data, but not just the story, a combination of both. And then from a colleague from a community foundation, actually down here in Florida, in Palm Beach County, but pretty well representative of community foundations and the kinds of things that they are looking for. They share first, you want to be sure that you can generate results within the grant period. You know, so while the dream may be to eliminate food insecurity in your community, are you going to be able to do that for $5,000 for 3 years? Probably not. So you want to be sure you break down what those changes are going to be or anticipated to be toward that ultimate goal. Okay. He also, or they also, this particular group highlights that you want to be sure that your plan for evaluation and measurement creates actual results, that you're not just saying more people will attend the market, but you have a prediction of how many more you anticipate. Attendance will grow by 25%. Or, you know, particular marginalized communities will have more access to it. And you'll want to share how that's going to happen, how you're going to measure that or know that. They know that we won't, you know, those numbers may not be exactly what we anticipate when we then report it back out. That's okay. But we want them to know we have thought about this, right? Highlight why you're the right one for the job. Highlight how you will leverage those dollars, and be sure that the budget matches the project. I've seen this happen a few times where someone is applying for $500 to do a $10,000 project. if they don't show you where the rest of that funding is coming from, it's hard to trust that they're really going to be able to do that. So you want to be sure your project and what you're asking for matches. And if you're asking for a portion, that you share how the rest of those funds will be gained. And the last thing I'll leave you with, and again, you can take a look at these on your time, but just a list of key things that are typical common mistakes. Number one, most reported mistake is that the applicant didn't follow directions. No matter what the grant process is, there are typically a list of directions. And I did happen to pull up the, let me find which one it is here. As we wrap, the Indie Food Fund was one example of a grant application that has a lot of different steps. And at the very end of the information about the grant is a section about if you're in Indianapolis or Marion County, there's a certain thing that you have to apply for before you'll ever be considered for any of the rest of the funding. So read through all of the information first and follow through, because it won't matter how amazing your application is. If you haven't done this one particular part of the application, you may be thrown out and they may never see your application. So that's the number one mistake that's reported. Now, the number one most irritating mistake that we hear about from funders all over is typos. It seems, I mean, we all make them, it happens, but you definitely want to have someone else read your work, right? Use some of those proofreading strategies we learned way back in the day to go back through and make sure that typos are, as best as you can are fixed or clean. You want to make sure your budget matches. There are people on these review committees who are your math whizzes who are going to check your math. So you want to be sure the math adds up and makes sense, and that the amount you're asking for matches the range that they're going to fund, right? And then you want to pay attention to the timelines. You want to pay attention to the deadlines, and you want to be sure that you ask for the grant. Right? You want to be sure that you say, we are looking for funding of $5,000 to solve this issue. You want to spell out that you are in fact asking for funding. So again, lots of different things to keep in mind. That's a very quick zip through the process. I hope that it's been helpful as you think about preparing your grant proposal, searching for funders, and preparing that proposal process, working through that process. Certainly, if you want to learn more, I will tell you the fundraising school here at the Lilly School of Philanthropy does offer a fundraising from foundations and grant management course, as well as one on fundraising from the business sector if you're looking for corporate partners. And in fact, we have 20 other courses online and in person around the country. We host free weekly podcasts, quarterly webinars, and many other fundraising programs as well. So my friends, thank you for your time and your attention today. Keep doing the amazing work that you are doing in the field for us, and know that the 1.5 million or so of us in the nonprofit sector really are making the world better. So thank you for your time, and I am happy to answer a few questions.
I think we have one. Teresa, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I was actually cheering and
okay.
to raise my hand, but I want to thank everyone for just a real quick introduction. I'm with IUPUI in the Office of Community Engagement, and I want to thank you all for being here. And I apologize for being late, because guess what? I was doing some fundraising work, so I was a little late. But looking forward, we have 2 other sessions in this series, and looking forward to seeing all of you at those. So I'll get out of the way for real questions.
So if anybody has a question, please unmute or type it into the chat. We do have time. I know Cathy and I go back a ways when we started grant writing way back when. And yeah, please feel free to ask Cathy anything.
You're also welcome to jot my email down if a question comes up later and it's something I can help with. I am more than happy to do that. So know that that's available to you as well. I'll give you a second there. There's also a nice little QR code. We've gotten all high tech just very recently at the fundraising school. So that'll take you to course information if you want to learn more.
And I will share this in an email, the PDF for the presentation in the handout that Cathy shared with us. So you'll be receiving a follow-up email from me in a day or two. Well,
I will
I
stop my
think
share
you
then.
did an awesome job. We don't have any questions, so I just want to thank Cathy and Teresa for providing this opportunity and this wonderful information. And please reach out to Cathy if you have any questions. And we look forward to seeing you all. This is our last monthly webinar for the year, and we'll see everyone in January 2022. So thank you to everyone, and happy